You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is about the topic of inheritance. If you're a parent, should you plan to leave your kids an inheritance? And on the other side, if there's the potential that you might inherit some money in the future, should you factor this into your plans for achieving financial independence? And how much should you rely on inheriting money in future in making your own financial plans? So I'm going to be talking about these two questions. And although money is a useful thing, I'm going to suggest that for both leaving your kids money and for potentially inheriting money, there are some significant downsides and problems to consider when it comes to the topic of inheritance. So that's what we're talking about in this week's episode. Before we do, though, I just want to say a big thank you to my new patron on Patreon. Thank you, Heather C. If you would like to support The Voluntary Life, you can get bonus episodes and many other awards by becoming a patron on Patreon. And as an example, over the last month, I've released 3 new bonus episodes to my patrons. Bonus episode 14 is called The Appeal of Stoicism Part 2. Bonus episode 15 is about speculating in cryptocurrencies. And bonus episode 16 is called Tax Strategies and My Experience as an Entrepreneur. So you can get those and many other bonus episodes, as well as many other awards, by becoming a patron. If you'd like to find out more about that, I'll put a link in the show notes, and you can also find information on my website, thevoluntarylife.com, or directly on my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. So on to the topic of inheritance. And before we get into the details, I want to just make a few clarifications up front. I'm only talking about adult children inheriting money in this podcast. I'm not talking about kids. Obviously, I think it's very important for parents to take care of their children. And if you die before your children are fully adults, then it's really important that you're able to leave something to your spouse and your kids to help them cope in the absence of you, especially if you're the one who's the breadwinner. And I think spouses are a different question too. If you have joint finances, then leaving your spouse an inheritance is a very different matter from leaving your adult children an inheritance. So I'm really talking about adult children who, once they've grown up, does it make sense for you to leave them a significant amount of money? And I'm really talking about money that you make in your own life. If you're a first generation financially independent person, I'm not talking about money that you have inherited, because in a way that's kind of a multi-generational thing. I think if I had inherited some money, I would understand that in some ways it might be part of the deal to pass that on to my own kids because I hadn't made it myself. And I can understand some circumstances where you might inherit some property or some valuables that you look after during your life, but it's kind of part of the deal of you inheriting them that you're supposed to pass them on to the next generation. It's like a bequest that your own ancestors have left you and you can pass it on. I had a friend who had a beautiful antique engagement ring in his family, and his mother gave that ring to him when he wanted to propose to his now wife. And I can really understand that that's something that's kind of being passed down from generation to generation. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about money that you have earned in your own life. If you've been working towards financial independence, should you give money to your kids once they're adults? So that's the question I'm going to start with first. And the second question that I'll address afterwards is whether or not it makes sense to count on receiving an inheritance in terms of your own financial planning. If you think that there's a possibility that you might inherit money in future. I don't have an inheritance. I've never inherited money, but I have met lots of people who have inherited money. And this is also a question for me in the longer term that I don't have good answers to yet, but I'm thinking about the question of what does it make sense to leave your children in terms of an inheritance once they're adults. Now, this is something that I started thinking about, prompted by a book called The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas Stanley. And he has some interesting conclusions about first-generation millionaires and their families from his own research. And he basically made the argument in that book that if you are a self-made millionaire, you should be very careful about giving your children the expectation of receiving an inheritance, because his observation from his own research was that it doesn't work out very well, that often the children of millionaires don't have the same entrepreneurial drive or focus that their parents who actually made the money had. And Thomas Stanley made the argument that just the idea, the expectation of inheriting wealth in the future can actually have a very damaging impact on the adult child of a wealthy person's ability to find their own way in life and to carve out their own direction and their own career, for want of a better word, or just, sense of purpose and drive in life. And although Thomas Stanley didn't express it in these words, he was basically making the argument that if children grow up with the expectation that they will inherit money, it kind of infantilizes them and it prevents them from maturing in a financial sense and taking care of themselves because they don't have to. And the result that Thomas Stanley was really wanting to focus on, like his main conclusion, is that first-generation millionaires are very frugal and very sensible about money and very careful with their expenditures. And what happens is that in the second generation, the kids who've grown up with that money don't understand the value of the money because they didn't earn it. And consequently, they're not frugal and they tend to blow it. They basically lose the family wealth through poor financial management. There's a good quote about this by a writer called Ernest Benn. He wrote, "My opinion is that the much talked of idle rich are very largely engaged in losing money made for them by previous generations who became rich because they were not idle." So I've read some interesting studies like The Millionaire Next Door, which suggest that inheriting money is not necessarily a very positive thing. So I don't have all the answers on this question, but I am tending towards the idea that in terms of parenting, what makes sense is to give your kids everything that they could possibly need while they're growing up, when they're dependent on you. And then once they become adults, you treat them as adults. And treating them adults means that they are self-sufficient, they are in charge of their own lives, and it's up to them to get on with their own lives. And of course, among adults, there are all sorts of voluntary interdependencies. You can have friends that you want to help out financially, and you can choose to give money to charities, and you can choose to help people. And in the same way, I think there's nothing wrong with choosing to help your kids as one adult to another adult. But if your kids come to depend on your money and come to rely on the idea that they're going to inherit money from you, that puts them in a relationship of dependency as an adult, which doesn't look healthy to me. It doesn't seem like that's a good way for that adult child to find their own way in life and to determine their own future. So I don't know all the answers to this question about whether or not your kids should inherit money. And one of the reasons for me doing this podcast is because I'm thinking about this kind of thing. But my current thinking on it is that it probably doesn't make sense to leave your kids a lot of money. And it certainly doesn't make sense for your kids to expect to receive a lot of money. I think it makes most sense to invest heavily in being there as a parent and in giving your kids everything that they need, especially your time. And then once they're adults, treating them as an adult. And that means they take care of themselves. And it's up to them to work out their own financial future. That's sort of what I'm leaning to at the moment. And I also noticed that I think there are many cases that I've seen of families where the parents have been pretty crappy parents and very absent, but they've left a lot of money to their kids, or they've given their kids a lot of money as adults. And that's the kind of consolation prize. And that runs totally counter to my understanding of what good parenting is. If you have the option to invest more time and resources in being a parent while your kids are kids and then leaving them less money later, then I would definitely take that option as opposed to investing less time and resources in your kids while they're kids and then leaving them money later. That's not your job as a parent. Your job is to be there when your kids really need you, which is when they're kids. So what about the second question of whether or not it makes sense to plan on receiving an inheritance in terms of your own financial planning and your own journey towards financial independence. You may know that there is some money in your family, and you may be kind of counting on the idea that you're going to get that at some point in the future. I would strongly suggest that you do not rely at all on the idea of any inheritance coming your way for two reasons. The first reason is you really might not get it. There's many things that can go wrong between now and whenever in the future where you think you might inherit some wealth. And the second reason is I think it's a really unhealthy basis for a relationship with your parents. So on that first question, you may assume that some money is going to be there for you, and you may assume that your parents are going to leave it to you, but that doesn't always happen. Firstly, your parents have to not screw up and lose the money. They have to be financially responsible and not get themselves into debt. And it's possible that they won't still have the money. And even if they are responsible, bad things can happen and they may not have the wealth that you now think they have. And secondly, situations can change and your parents might split up and your relationship with them might change and all sorts of things can happen. So I wouldn't rely on getting any kind of inheritance. In my own case, I assumed that I was going to inherit some wealth when I was in my 20s, and then I realized that that was not going to happen. My family is a very odd mixture of wealth and poverty. In my grandparents' generation, on one side, my grandparents had absolutely nothing. They didn't even have electricity. And my grandparents on the other side of my family were quite wealthy. They had numerous properties. So there was some wealth in my family that got passed down from generation to generation. I knew about this, and I knew that on one side of my family, there was this wealth that had got passed down from my grandparents' generation to my parents' generation. So I assumed that I was also going to get an inheritance. And I found that to be quite a reassuring thought. During my 20s, when I was doing lots of studying and trying to find my direction in life, I didn't think about it often, but I definitely knew in the back of my mind that there was some wealth in my family and that I was probably going to inherit some property or something, and that would be definitely a financial help. At some point in my mid-20s, it was made clear to me that I was not going to inherit what I thought I was going to inherit, and that was a big shock. I found it to be a huge motivating factor in my own life. And I went from, in my 20s, doing a lot of studying and saving a bit of money through some consultancy work, but not very much, to, in my 30s, working extremely hard, building a business and getting it to profitability and eventually selling it. The point I'm making here is that when I realized that I wasn't inheriting any money, it really lit a fire under me to sort my own life out and to take care of myself, because I realized that if I wanted to achieve financial independence, if I wanted to have financial security, it was up to me to make it happen. And if I didn't, it wasn't going to happen. And I find it interesting that I know in myself, I certainly experience a different level of motivation to find my direction when I knew that I wasn't going to receive an inheritance. And I think it goes beyond just money. I think it's not just about the fact that not receiving an inheritance meant that I knew I had to work hard to earn my own money. I believe it also pushed me to grow up and to be independent of my parents and to take on the challenge of finding my own direction in life and defining my own life for myself rather than waiting for economic assistance from my parents, waiting to be bailed out, essentially. Although I'm currently tending towards the view that it's better not to give your kids an inheritance, it's not because I didn't get an inheritance. I felt very hurt finding out that I wasn't going to receive what I thought was a family inheritance, and it didn't feel like it was based on any kind of principle. The whole circumstances about me finding out I wasn't going to get an inheritance were not good, and I certainly wouldn't want to repeat that kind of circumstances myself, but I do still think that getting an inheritance can have its own problems. And I do think that realizing I would have to take care of myself was an important aspect of growing up financially for me. The second reason that I don't think it's wise to rely on an inheritance is because it puts you in a state of extended childlike dependency on your parents. It prevents you from growing up financially, basically. And I don't think that's a healthy basis for a positive relationship with your parents. Once you're an adult, you've got to find a way of having an adult-to-adult relationship with your parents and not continuing to be a child And if you're waiting on their money, then you are kind of being childlike. A lot of very poisonous family dynamics come from these kind of financial dependencies. If you can have a positive, happy relationship with your parents, then you should cherish it. But if you don't have a positive, happy relationship with your parents and you're sticking around for money, then that's really unhealthy for you. And the more that you rely on an inheritance, the less you're going to be focused on finding your own path in life. Some parents who are not good parents dangle this carrot of inheritance and of continued financial support. They dangle that over their adult children. And that strikes me as a very, very unhealthy dynamic to have. So even if you might inherit some money from your parents in future, you should just assume that you're not going to and plan your life on that basis. And then if you do inherit some money, it's going to be a nice bonus for you, but you're not going to be planning your whole life around it because it might not happen anyway. And you're certainly going to have a better basis for a good relationship with your parents if you're not angling on getting money from them. So these are my thoughts about the topic of inheritance at the moment. As I said, I have not come to final conclusions about this topic. I'm really interested to hear your ideas because it's something that I'm still thinking through myself. My current thinking is that the healthiest approach as a parent is to be there and invest everything in your kids when they really need you, which is as kids, and then treat them like adults when they are adults. And especially not to have this expectation that they're going to be receiving continuing economic support from you or a big inheritance in the future, because I think that will get in the way of their own individuation and it will get in the way of them leading their own lives. And similarly, as an adult child of parents who have some resources, if you think you might inherit some money in the future, I would not rely on that. Because it's not a healthy basis for your relationship with your parents, and it's certainly not a healthy basis for your own financial planning, and you might not get anything. So it's best to plan not to get anything, rather than stay in a holding pattern in terms of your own financial life, waiting for some big financial windfall in the future that might never come. So those are my initial thoughts about this topic. I'd love to hear your thoughts. That's all for this week's episode. I hope you have a great week, and I'll be back next week with another episode.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.